Hey folks, welcome back. I'm Dave and we're here in my shop where I build E-War guitars. Well, this is going to be episode number 11 of the tutorial series on how to build an electric guitar. And in this video, I'm going to go step by step on everything I do to get this fretboard ready and installed, and fret markers put in, and radius, and binding, and all that stuff. Anyway, I think the neck is really turning out cool. I really do. And I'm really trying to cover all the steps in these videos too, to show you just how I do it. Anyway, I hope you stick around and check it out. And if you dig it, how about you give me a like and subscribe? Anyway, let's get rolling with the video. Okay, so our neck is moving along nicely. We've got the truss rod in, fits really tight, nice and flush on top. Snug on both ends, so it looks really good. I've got the headstock plate on, and I've got this little the cut here for the nut, and it's nicely angled, and the nut fits really tight against it. And the next step in this neck for me, the way I do it, is I like to put my fretboard on next. And before I put my fretboard on, I got to cut the slots in it for the frets. So what we're using, this is a piece of ebony. I got this from Stu Mac. It's a fretboard blank. And it's a piece of 1/4 inch thick ebony. It's about 2.5 inches wide. It was a tiny little bit cupped, so I took my bench plane and I planed off the back a little bit to get the cup out. So now it's nice, really nice and flat on the back, and that is what we're going to be working on. So the tools I like to use for doing my fret work is this is a Stu Mac. It's a fret slotting gauge, I guess you'd call it. And it's got two different scale lengths on it. This edge up here is a 25-inch scale length, which is the one we're going to be using. And this other one down here is the 25.5-inch fender scale length. So anyway, we're going to use that, and in conjunction with this guy right here, it's just my fret slotting sled I have for my table saw. I've got the 20 thousandths kerf saw blade, circular saw or table saw blade that I use to cut the slots. And we're going to use this jig right here. So I want to pull the camera in a little bit closer and kind of show you the jig and the template and what we're going to do. So let me pull the camera in and we're going to get on that next. Okay, so let me just go over this fret slotting gauge really quickly for anybody that may not be familiar with it. This is I bought from Stu Mac. And like I said, it's got two scale lengths on it. One side, this edge here is 25 and this edge here is 25.5. Well, for this guitar, it's going to be a 25-inch scale length, so we're going to use this side. And if you see, it's got these little notches in here. They're about a 1/16 of an inch notch, and they correspond to this. I hope you can see it in here. If you see right here, I've got a line, okay? And at the bottom of that line, I've got a pin sticking through there. I've got a little pin and it pokes through the back. And then just, that's about a 1/2 inch away from this slot in the thing, which is where the blade's going to ride. And this other line is the center line of the blade. So what you do is you take your fretboard, okay, and of course the fretboard is going to be facing down because it's got to be at the blade. And I lay my fret slotting with double-sided sticky tape. I lay my fret slotting gauge on top of it like that. I line it up really nicely on the edge. And then the way I do it, I put the end of the fretboard at this very first notch here, okay? So that's the first notch, and you can see a little pencil line right there. That's actually going to be the first cut. So that's going to be the cut at the nut, okay? So anyway, so I slide this in like so, and that notch aligns with that little pin I've got in there. So I lay it in there, I'll slide it across the table saw, and the blade sticks up. Incidentally, I stick the blade up like the full tooth height, sticking up above this, and that seems to work really well for me for the length or the depth of the tang on the fret slot on the frets. So anyway, so I lay it in here, and my first cut with that notch in there, my first cut is going to be right here. And since my fretboard is lined up on this line, that means my first cut is going to be a 1/2 inch off the end of the fretboard, which I'll ultimately cut that off. And then each time, so you pass it through the saw, and then you back it up, and then you line up that notch on the pin for the next notch, and that'll be my first fret. and so on and so forth. You just keep moving on down the line until it's all done. And then you can see on the end here, I have that one marked. That's going to be my 22nd fret, which this fretboard is going to have 22 frets. Then the very next one, which would be the 23rd fret, I have that marked as end. So that's where I'm going to cut off on this end here. And that's going to ultimately be the end of my fretboard. So anyway, I'm going to get a little double-sided sticky tape, stick this thing on, and go over to my table saw, and we're going to start cutting this fret slots. I should have showed it a second ago, but here's that StewMac blade I use. So it's a special blade. It's just for fret slotting, and as you can see, it actually tapers down near the edge, and it gives us a 20 thousandths of an inch kerf to it. So that is the blade we're going to be using too. So you got to keep in mind when you're cutting a fretboard when it's still flat, you can't just go by the depth of the tang, because after all, you're going to be radiusing this thing and you're going to be losing some of the depth. So I figured out after a while about the depth to do, and it's around 1/8 of an inch, and it works out well in the end. So once you get it set, you just go along with that jig and move it along, and the fret spacing is perfect every time. And I tell you, I've cut them by hand before, and if you plan on building more than a couple of guitars, that fret slot and jig and that blade is well worth the investment, because the time it takes to do it by hand versus this is unbelievable. Of course, I saw off the ends, and then I'll square them up real nice in that shooting board too. Just makes it really nice. You want that thing to fit really super tight against that nut, and you go through those few steps and you're going to have a perfect fit every time. Okay, so I think our fretboard came out pretty nice. All of them came real true and straight and everything, and after I was done, last thing I did on the table saw was I raised the blade up and I cut all but just a little bit of the two ends here, and then I sawed them off, and then I set them on my shooting board and I squared them up with my plane. So they're really nice, and they fit good. Fits really well against the nut and everything. And so the next couple of steps I want to do on this guy here is, as I'm getting ready to glue them on, I want to go ahead and cut it to the rough width. I'm going to leave it a bit wide so I could then run it through my router table over there and plane it off with the edge of the neck. I also I'm going to go over to my spindle sander, my oscillating spindle sander. I like doing a little bit of a concave curve at the very bottom, just below the 22nd fret where it comes in and meets the pickup ring right here, because I think that looks kind of cool. And I want to do that, well, I could set it up on my spindle sander with this edge still being 90 degrees to the end, so I have a nice straight concave curve at the bottom of this thing. Okay, and then I'm going to get ready and glue it onto the neck. But to do that, I'm going to use my nut to space it off of my headstock veneer. Okay, and now a little earlier I went ahead and I squared up the nut really nice on the shooting board, and I flattened off the two sides. But just to get it down to the final thickness it's going to be, I'm going to go ahead and I've got 3 different grits of sandpaper. I got 320, 400, and 600 grit, and I'm going to go ahead and hit these 2 flat faces again, just to bring them. It won't be polished and finished and everything, but it's going to bring it to its final size. So when I actually glue that fretboard on, I'm going to sandwich it up against this nut, and to be sure that that width is just dead on. So when in the end we fit this nut in there, we have a really nice snug fit. So anyway, I'm going to turn the camera down, and we're going to go ahead and clean these up and then start working on that fretboard. So that's a piece of granite I have those that sandpaper glued to, and that just makes sure that you have a really flat surface you're sanding on, because I try to get that nut just perfect in every direction. So now I'm just over here, I'm sanding that little radius on the bottom of the thing, and I noticed it was leaning a little bit. It wasn't coming out real straight, so I ran a piece of tape down one side to square it up, and then it came out real nice. Because if that radius isn't just right, it'll look off with your frets. So, but it turned out good. So now I'm getting ready to cut this down to its rough width. So
So of course I go back and I find the center, and I use my template to mark it out. I'm going to cut this a little big, maybe a 1/16 big on either side, just to get it to its rough width before we glue it on.
Okay, so we are set to glue this thing on here. So I got my nut and it's sized down like I said. What I'm going to do is I'm going to center this guy up here on both ends. Got my center mark going right down the middle. Of course, I've got my walnut strip down there that I know is in the middle. Okay, so this is what it is so hard to get these things glued on there without some kind of an indexing pin or something to hold it. So I use this right here. This is side dot marking rod. It's a piece of PVC plastic and it's 3/32 in diameter. And the cool thing about this stuff is I could drill it right down there in the center of a fret slot, and that hole will get covered by the fret itself. So I'm going to drill one up here on this end, just right next to the truss rod. And then I'm going to drill one down at the other end also on the opposite side. And that works really well. So I've got my 3/32 bit set up. I'm nice and tight on my nut. I'm centered. I'm centered there. I'm going to drill just off to the side here.
That is really a great trick using that side dot marking rod. I mean, it holds it real tight. It fits perfect in the 3/32 hole, and it just works perfect. It really is a good idea.
There we go. Nut fits good. I'm centered. I'm centered. Okay. That looks good. We're ready to glue that thing on right there. I got to cut this guy down first. We don't need it sticking all the way up like that. Nice. See that nut's in there? It ain't going nowhere. Nice and snug. Fits really good on both sides. Looks good.
So I use a 1/2 inch wide piece of tape to cover over that truss rod, just to keep the glue mostly out of it. I'm sure some of it gets squeezed into it, but it just kind of keeps the glue back a little bit. It minimizes how much gets around the truss rod. I try to do a good job of spreading it, just, you know, like the right amount. You know, I hate glue dripping all over everything. I do my best to keep it fairly clean. Snug it up against the nut nice, get it on my indexing pins. Now that's a piece of granite I clamped this down to. And incidentally, that's why I keep the back of this neck flat this whole time through this whole process, is to keep everything just as straight as possible. And I'm clamping it right to a piece of granite, which is perfectly flat and straight too. So see how the granite clamps in that bench? That is a really cool bench to have. A lot of good features on it. Now I'm just routing it up.
Okay, so I think that came out really nice. Came out real clean. I ran it through the router. That joint turned out really, really nice. I'm very happy with it. The nut fits in there tight as could be. Nut fits in there beautifully. And I think what I want to do with this, because I've got the red heart stripes in there, I'm going to do some red heart binding on this, and I'm going to do red heart binding on the body. So I'm going to set up right now and do that. But when I do it, I'm going to do it to where there's just a little bit of the ebony showing below it, because I think that looks really cool. Maybe a 32nd of an inch or something like that. And the way we're going to do that is I've got this router bit. It's a bearing router bit, and there's just a little bit of an offset. The offset from the cutting part of the blade to the bearing is the same thickness as the binding. This is a router bit set I bought from Stu Mack, and it comes with the one cutter head, but there's several different bearings that come with the kit that you pick the one that most closely matches your binding you're going to do. And I always do it in my little trim router right here because it's just easier to handle and balance on top of the fretboard. So anyway, so I'm going to get set up, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to put some binding on this thing before we radius the fretboard.
So once I get my router all set to depth and the bit in there, I always run a little test piece too, because you want to be absolutely sure before you go hacking on something like that neck I got so much work in that you've got the right bearing and everything else. So I always do a test piece. And it's pretty simple. You just run it down there and it cuts a real clean cut. Just makes it real nice. And I really like leaving that little bit of extra fretboard showing under the binding because I just think that has a really super cool look to it.
Okay, so there they are routed in. Let me see if I can get it in the camera here. I think that looks pretty cool. We got just a little bit, maybe a little more than a 32nd in there. And I've squared up the ends here, and I'm going to glue these in with the nut in place because I'm going to push them hard against that nut because we want that joint to fit perfect when we go to put the nut in the end. Anyway, and the way we're going to do this is I'm going to put a little glue on there, spread it out, and then I'm going to use my binding tape. Right here, I got my little dispenser right there. We're going to hold it down with binding tape. So that is what we're going to do.
So putting binding on a neck is real easy. It causes some, it's got some extra work when it comes to doing the frets and everything, but man, it is such a good look, and it's worth the extra work, I think, you know, for how it looks and everything. And I think it's really cool. It covers up the ends of the fret slot too, so you don't have them exposed on the edge of the fretboard. So it is extra work, but it's a good look, and I think it's worth it, you know. Of course, I'm just going to plane them down. They're sticking up a little bit because they're a little taller than that edge of the fretboard. And I've got to shave down the ends to match that radius on the end of the fretboard and saw them off. And really turned out cool in the end. Oh, and that's my little fret slot cleaning thing because glue does get in there.
Okay, so we've got the binding on. It came out real nice. I got it trimmed down on top, and I cut the ends here to fit the curve at the bottom of the fretboard, and it all looks good. I'm really pleased with the way it came out. And the next thing we're going to do is it's time to cut the radius on the top of this fretboard. And to do that, we're going to use this jig right here, okay, and we're going to use this router with this other part of the jig here. So let me show you how this works. So this is basically a base I made for the router. You've probably seen something like this before. I just simply took some wood and cut a 12-inch radius on it, cut the wood into a 12-inch radius. I actually applied a little Formica to the bottom of this too to help it slide on the rails a little bit better. And then in the router I've got a 2-flute straight cutting bit that will cut flat on the bottom too. In other words, the carbide pieces extend beyond the steel on the router bit, and it'll cut flat on the bottom. I think most of them are that way. But anyhow, so basically this router is basically going to, it's going to sit on top of here, and we're going to have our neck placed in the center. We're going to stick it down with some double-sided sticky tape, and I'm basically going to run this router back and forth like so, and I'll keep rotating it around, run it again, rotate it, run it again. And it cuts a beautiful job. Does a beautiful job. All it needs after we're done with this is a little bit of light sanding. Anyway, I'm going to get this camera turned down where you can see what I'm doing here. And we're going to set this thing up. We're going to get our neck stuck down to the bottom, and we're going to start routing away. So let's get rolling.
So one thing that's absolutely critical on doing something like this is making sure that neck is running absolutely dead center down the middle of that framework I've got. And so I check and recheck to make sure it is before I start routing on the thing. Now you can see I have a board on that jig that elevates the neck up till it's just about flush with the top of those rails. I've got the board clamped in with those bolts coming out of the side, and then I just glue the neck down with some double-sided sticky tape. Now once you set the depth, I check it in a few different spots, and once it's set, you just run it back and forth. It takes probably 5 minutes to run that thing. And when you have a good sharp bit in there, I mean, it comes out really, really, really super clean. Takes a little sanding, but I spend more time sanding off the fret markers once I get those in than anything.
All right, let me get out my little fret radius and gauge and let's see how we did. I mean, that just looks awesome. Really does. A little bit of the white line showing right here in the very end. I guess that spot might have been a little bit low, but we're about to use my fret radiusing blocks, sanding blocks, and we're going to sand this up. Hey, I'm just curious. I want to check the. Let me check that straightness too. There's no daylight under that thing whatsoever. That turned out really nice. That turned out good. I'm very happy with that.
So I just wanted to show you another look at the thing. You can see those lines in there. That's grain. That is not the cuts from the router. You can see some very faint cuts from the router, but it is very, very minor. It really is a good jig. If you're going to build, you know, more than a couple guitars, there again, that's just a good jig to make and have, and really, really is good. So I'm just marking out the fret dots. You can see I got my my template next to me. Sure don't want to make a mistake putting a dot in the wrong place, that's for sure. So I've got them all laid out. I count them to be sure I'm right, and then I'll just drill away. That's tricky getting the depth of that, those fret markers. I usually wind up drilling them just a little bit deep, and then I float them in the CA glue. That's Star Bond black CA glue, which I really like. I mean, not that there's much of a line left around the edge of these things, but any little deviation, that Star Bond fills it in and it looks really good. And I basically use that little putty knife and I just float them in there until they're just as flush as I could get them. Those are abalone dots, by the way, too, which I think looks really cool against the ebony fretboard. I squirt a little accelerator on it and them things are dry. Now I go back to my, that's my radiusing sanding block. And I think I've got 320 on there, maybe 220, because I had the fret dots to sand off. But it needs very, very little work. More to sand off the fret dots than anything. I'm constantly checking it for straight too, because you want that fretboard just as perfect as possible. An interesting thing, when you're sanding back and forth like that, it tends to sand the center more than the ends. So you can see here where I went back to each end and I just hit it maybe 10 times, 10 swipes on each end, and it made it perfectly level. I was very happy with this fretboard. It turned out really, really well. Very happy. Now I'm just checking the radius again, make sure it all still looks good. This is after all the heart of the guitar right here, so you want to make sure it's right.
Well, folks, we better leave it about there for now. I hope somebody got something out of this. I'm enjoying the heck out of doing these videos, and I really like showing the whole process, because, you know, this is how I learned how to build guitars, was watching guys on YouTube, and I really enjoy it and I love it, and I hope I inspire somebody out there to maybe think, hey, maybe I could do this too. Anyway, God bless you. Thanks for watching. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and we'll see you all in the next one.